first of all, setting the scene. China joined the WTO in 2001, and ever since it's been in a rapid development. Could you sketch that a little bit, and particularly from the moment on that the current Chinese president took over?
Okay, sure. So China's accession to the WTO was clearly a very, very big deal. But that's not where it all started. So I'm going to go right back to the beginning and very, very quickly talk about sort of how China became a sort of part of the global system. So of course, China's reform and opening started at the very end of 1978. And then by the mid-1980s, China was beginning to receive FDI. Okay. And that really became a flood by the late 1990s, ahead of WTO accession. With China joining the WTO, though, of course, this pushed exports to a new level, and it massively expanded China's access to global markets. And that's really what caused China to become the new factory of the world. So we saw a massive relocation of industry to China. A good example would have been Taiwanese electronics. They moved en masse from Taiwan across to China. Then trade as a share of China's GDP surged by 27% on average from 2001. That was from the entrance to WTO to 2008. Exports peaked as a percentage of GDP in China in 2007 at 35%. Since then, actually, they've come down a little bit. And China became the world's largest exporter in 2009. So that really is kind of background to how China became the world's biggest exporter. But I think this was the start really of China's sort of entrance onto the global scene. But I think another important aspect here is China's investment abroad. That really began in 1999 when the then president Jiang Zemin launched something called Go Out or Going Out. And that sort of started off slowly. This was really about China going out and buying commodities around the world and trying to force Chinese companies to become more globally competitive by forcing them to compete abroad. And the idea eventually was to create big multinational Chinese companies. There was a big boost to China in this from sort of 2008 with the great financial crisis, when suddenly lots of assets were much cheaper and China went out and bought up lots of things. But I think there's been a sea change since Xi Jinping took power in 2012. And sort of Xi Jinping, one of the first things he spoke about was the China dream, and achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so what that means in simple terms is to make China great again, to put it into sort of Trumpian terms.
Have we heard that before?
Yeah, exactly. In 2017, he put it a different way. He spoke about a new era. But, what this all really means is he wants China to be, the world superpower, at least alongside the US. And actually, China has set a target to achieving this, which is 2049, which is the centenary, 100 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China. Now, as a part of this bid, China wants to be a global leader. It needs to become an economic leader. And to become an economic leader, it needs to start somewhere. Okay, so it's sort of started sort of in its neighborhood at first, but it's been sort of pushing out to try to encompass all developing countries. And I think this is really what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. And so this is
launched when he just got on the reign, right?
Yes, so Xi Jinping took over as party secretary, head of the Communist Party, which is the big job, in late 2012. Then he became president, sort of head of the government, sort of head of state. They have a premier as well, but essentially the person in charge of government in 2013. And then towards the end of 2013, he launched the Belt and Road. This is, it is about creating new markets and opening up new markets for Chinese construction firms. It's definitely about that. It has a sort of practical component. But it's also a part of China's grand strategy for trying to become an economic leader. And so the way this works really is that China's been promoting economic integration through physical connectivity. So doing things like building roads and railways and power grids and ports, all those things. And essentially what China does is it goes to poorer countries and says, look, you need all of this stuff in order to develop. but you can't afford to build it and you don't have the capacity to build it. We will lend you the money and our firms will come in and build it for you. And so it is about that, but by doing that, China is building its economic and political influence as well. And I suppose the analogy that I gave in my book when I was looking particularly at China's neighborhood was that China sees itself at the center of its own solar system. So China is the sun, and it's surrounded by planets, and it wants to pull those planets more into its economic orbit. Okay, so it wants those planets almost to circle the sun being China. Of course, for those planets, for those countries, the big fear is that they become too dependent on China and they get too close to that sun and they get burned. Okay, but this is really what the Belt and Road is about. It's trying to pull the world now, the developing world, into China's orbit. And this started off looking at Asia mainly, particularly Central Asia, Eurasia, and then it's sort of opened out into looking at the sort of Southeast Asia region and the sort of sea links from China across to Europe. But it's grown enormously over the past 3 or 4 years, and now more than 140 countries are a part of the Belt and Road. And so, whatever you think about its success, it is a very, very big deal, and it's taken very, very seriously.
And then the second plan, if you wish, is Made in China 2025, yes. And perhaps taking it forward to the China 2035 standards that we expect later this year.
Sure. So if you see the Belt and Road as China's bid to become a sort of economic and sort of political leader, I think Made in China 2025 is about China's bid to become a technological leader. So it's a sort of aspect designed to make China a leader in technological design and innovation. So China for quite a long time has been very, very good at making things and adapting the IP of other countries. Obviously it has some of its own IP now as well, but it wants to become a global leader in technology as well. So rather than a country that has to pay for licenses and then uses licenses to make things, it wants to create and own those licenses itself. And so Made in China 2025 is a big industrial policy to promote this with massive state funding behind it. So you have what they call government venture funds, which are designed to subsidize technology firms with a target. This may have changed, but the original target was $750 billion worth. And of that, a big chunk, maybe around a quarter, was designed to go into semiconductors. Which is where China really feels that it needs to, it's vulnerable, particularly with what the US is doing. That's where it really does lag behind. And there's been a lot of concern from foreign firms about this because they worried that it was seen as favoring domestic champions in China and it may push out foreign firms. And so actually over the last 2 or 3 years, they've been downplaying this, at least abroad, but it hasn't actually gone anywhere. This is still very much one of their big policies. And I would argue that especially with the trade war and now what you'd call the tech war, actually it's becoming more important than it ever was. The Western world now is talking about a need for being less dependent on China, but China too needs to become less dependent on the world. So self-sufficiency is also the watchword in China as well. Yeah. And this is why we are now seeing, and the details aren't there yet, they haven't been released, but China is now talking about what you might term Made in China Mark II. And that's going to be called China Standards 2035. Now, this is really about setting global technological standards. If you want to be a global tech power, you have to own standards, and other countries have to adopt them. This is true today of the US. It's true of countries like Germany, of Holland, actually, so I should say Netherlands, of Japan. Those sort of tech superpowers. Now, China wants to take you guys on, essentially, and particularly in the next generation of technology. Obviously, it can't set standards in old tech, but it can in new tech. So we're talking about things like 5G, and Huawei is certainly already leading the field there, but also things like artificial intelligence in general. China's very, very big on that. The Internet of Things, big data, cloud computing, all of those things that people are very, very excited about at the moment. So China wants to be a leader in things like automation, green tech, biotech, and it wants to own those licenses. At the moment, China spends a lot of money purchasing other countries' licenses. It wants to be in charge. The way that this will work, I think, and as I say, there aren't many details yet, is that China first has to develop these standards at home. And China doesn't often, it has a bunch of different standards at home, and it needs to sort of consolidate those, and then it needs to internationalize them. And that means it will have to participate in multilateral standards bodies like the ISO and the ITU, so it can't do this all on its own. Then it has to find ways of pushing these around the world, sort of through perhaps those multilateral organizations. Again, we come back to the Belt and Road here. It's easier for China at first to push these standards in less economically powerful countries. So, if you look at 5G as an example with Huawei, Huawei is building out all of Africa's 5G. And it's very likely that Africa will have to follow Chinese standards now. Once you're on that railway track, as it were, you can't get off it. You can't just jump from one track to another track. Yep. So I think that's how it works. And the aim is really to dislodge the US and Europe from their top spot in terms of setting global standards. And this is one of the reasons why the world is so worried about China. So why is there a tech war with the US? Because the US fears that China is going to push it out of the way. And once it does that, then that really does set China up as a global superpower.
Yeah. Let's move into that topic. Because there's a lot of tension between the US and China, and we agreed to share some slides on that. So I'll get them in. Yeah.
Yep.
That we can have a look. Let's see.
So if we go to slide 1, you go down a little bit. So after China's yes. Just to kind of give a little bit of background to this. Of course, we all know about the tensions between China and the US, and these have certainly taken a turn for worse since the pandemic started. But I think I think fundamentally this comes down to sort of a question of geopolitics. And the US worried that China wants to be top dog, and it wants to protect itself. Any global superpower doesn't want another power to come in and dislodge it from the top of the world. So I think it's about geopolitics, but also it's underpinned, of course, by economics too, and that's what these charts are designed to show. And I think this all starts again, as we mentioned at the beginning, with the entrance to the WTO. So if you look at the solid lines here, you can see that since China entered the WTO, a huge amount of manufacturing capacity has shifted to China, and at the same time has shifted away from the US. So when China joined, only about 6% of global value added in manufacturing came from China. Now that is now at about sort of 26, 27%. At the same time, the US share has slipped substantially. And I think that's something, that scares the US. It's scared that it's losing its technological edge, and that's one of the things that does underpin its position as a leading power.
But this has been, sorry to, but yeah. China has overtaken the US already in 2010, and everybody knows that China is developing. But this gap is already huge, right? China is much bigger.
Huge. It is. Yeah, it is huge, but of course it's been getting bigger. There is the geopolitical and military element to this too. And so, China's become much more powerful, and it's become much more strident on the world stage. I think it was easier to accept China's growing economic might when it didn't look threatening. But under Xi Jinping, it's become a power that wants to be globally significant. It used to be the case that China, in Chinese terms, they would say it was hiding its light and biding its time. It's not hiding its light anymore. It's saying we want to be a global leader. And so I think that's why suddenly this has become much, much more worrying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think if we go down to the next slide, I think this is another reason why things have changed more recently. So it sort of partly answers your last question, actually. And that's that China has become a much, much bigger investor in the US itself. Okay, so it's not just about trade globally, it's also about China's role and also what China's been trying to do by buying up US firms, particularly tech firms. So you can see that China didn't really invest in the US at all until Xi Jinping really came into power, or just the year before. And there's been an enormous surge really since 2013. And you can see, if you look at the red there, you can see also in tech. And of course, again, that's something that the US is very, very worried about. And you can see that Chinese inflows hit their highest in 2017. And that, of course, was also the first year that Donald Trump was in power. That was also when all the kind of the rumblings of the trade war began to start. So I think that explains, why this has become such a big deal since then. So if we switch to the next slide.
Yeah, it's very clear to see Trump entering the stage there.
Yeah, exactly. But I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that, and this is actually a little bit surprising, I think, if you think about how difficult relations have been for the past couple of years, with the trade war, actually US investment in China has held up very, very well. It's been very, very stable. So I think this will begin to fall this year, partly because of COVID. It's very difficult to go out and sort of invest in new companies or in greenfield sites if you can't go and visit them. So that's an obvious thing. But also clearly tensions are now much worse than they were. So that's another reason why it would be very dangerous, I think, if you're a US firm to put too much investment into China. So I think that will begin to fall. But it gives you an idea, though, of how invested the US is in China itself. I think we'll skip this one. It doesn't really say anything new. And just to get back quickly to the Belt and Road again, I think the US, it's seen itself for the last 50 years as the big global actor. Well, this is a big change. You can call it the Belt and Road. You can call it going out. You can call it China's infrastructure diplomacy overseas. You can call it by kind of whatever name you like. But what this chart shows is China's economic activity. This shows foreign engineering projects, which is a major part of China's economic activity overseas. And you can see how much it's grown. Now, what this shows is activity on a monthly basis. So, times this by 12 to get the annual totals. And you can see that China, has foreign engineering projects sort of worth $250 billion a year or so. That's very, very large. The US has very, very little abroad. And so, I think that this is also feeding into American anxiety, that China is just becoming more important, more relevant around the world than the US is.
Yep.
And so, this has, along with all this anxiety, we're hearing lots and lots of talk about an incipient Cold War, a new Cold War, whatever you want to call it. And actually, I think as a firm, we were one of the first firms really to kind of talk about this in any detail. We started hammering this home back in 2017 or so. At the same time, though, I think it's very, very important to point out that we are not yet in a Cold War, and actually talking about a Cold War can be it can make you think about things in not quite the right way, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, that is, if you want to compare China to the Soviet Union, its economic ties with the US are sort of 10, 15 times greater. And I think this chart shows that very, very clearly. If you look at the share of total US trade that the Soviet Union had, it was only about 1%, whereas China's is around 15%. So that is very, very different. So their economies are far more entangled and remain far more entangled than the economies of the US and the Soviet Union were. We switch to the next chart.
Yeah, where you compare it with Japan.
Yeah, so I think actually, so in terms of trade, China's relationship with the US is much closer to that of Japan in the 1980s, just sort of shifted forward 30 years. Obviously there's a big difference here in that Japan was an ally of the US's and China is a geopolitical rival. But even when you saw the growth of trade trade with an ally, the US began to get very, very worried about that. It wasn't just trade; it was also investment. Japanese investment in the 1980s also deeply worried the US, and that's why you saw Japan very, very deliberately trying to kind of step back. But if you want to make comparisons, when it comes to the economic ties between two countries, Japan is much closer than the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and if you see these charts, you can only think, with Trump in the lead in the U.S., would you see this red line on China go down as deep as Japan went at the time?
It's what I'd say with all these charts, and I've got a couple more to show, is that they all seem to have peaked. So I think what we can say is that we've reached, certainly when it comes to anything involved with the US and China, things will begin to come down now, because it's not just Trump. I think there is a consensus in Washington that the US has to disentangle some of its economic ties. Okay. But even when it comes to bigger sort of global trade, I think there's going to be a push globally, and we can come to that later maybe, to move away from an enormous dependence on China. So I think all of these charts, we're going to see them either fall or flatten in the coming years. I think it's very, very difficult to see them continue to rise. Yeah. So this chart is quite interesting because it shows that beyond trade, US companies are deeply embedded in China's own market. And this is important because, decoupling, which is the word that, we've all been looking at for the last 2 or 3 years, would be incredibly costly, not just for China. Trump always talks about how China will be the big loser from a trade war or a tech war. But actually, the US too will be a big loser. And US firms are going to push very, very hard to maintain their ties in China. It's important to note here that US sales in China are worth 3 times US exports to China.
Wow.
China is an enormous market for the US, and that's been growing incredibly sharply for the past 10 years or so. China is a massive market, and US firms do not want to be shut out from that market. So, this whole process of disentangling the two economies is going to be sort of politically and economically fraught in the US as well.
And they've obviously made a lot of investments there. So,
well, yes.
Back out of it.
Well, yes. I mean, so, very, very costly indeed. And so, when it comes to what this means for kind of global growth, if we do see all of these charts beginning to fall, then clearly it's going to be very, very damaging. China has been, China's integration to global markets has been probably the biggest growth driver, well, certainly the biggest growth driver. I think we'll skip this. I think I'll move on. Yeah, it's been the biggest growth driver, in the globe for the last 15 years or so. We're already seeing a global trade, a structural slowdown of global trade, and any slowdown of trade is not going to be good for global growth. And then, if we're going to start to see supply chains having to move, so, whether that means actually leaving China or whether it simply means new investments being placed outside China, that is going to be more expensive. Any greater costs are not going to be good for growth either. And at the moment, it seems that the world has come to the conclusion that domestic security, whether that's economic security or geopolitical security, national security, health security, all these issues are more important actually than growth. Growth doesn't seem to be the major concern right now. So none of this is going to be, if you're an investor, this is something that I think you should be worried about.